As the ANC's highest decision-making body between conferences, the NEC sits to deliberate over the future of the party and, by extension, the presidency. We look back at the legacy President Zuma will leave behind and the new struggle that Ramaphosa has inherited. Joining me for this analysis of the economics of the Zuma years is Lead Researcher and Economist at Nascence Research Insight, Xhanti, Payi. And for analysis of the politics, we are joined by Lukhona, Mnguni, who is the political analyst at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Lukhona, perhaps if I begin with you, an emergency meeting being called today. Is today the day that the ANC finally draws the curtains on President Zuma as president?
Well, Fifi, we don't know. Someone said it was 8 days in September and many days in February. So I am still hopeful that we really do not know and can't call it. It is quite clear, though, that the NEC is under pressure to make a decisive call on the future of President Zuma and not be seen as dilly-dallying in the manner that we have seen events unfold this past week. I think the NEC has 2 or 3 options really left to it.
2 or 3 options. I mean, Xhanti, how do you see this playing out today?
Look, it's a tough one because I think the simple thing, of course, is that they don't have the authority to remove him, in the sense that it is only Parliament that has, and I think in a sense, even if they resolve to remove him, he can still say no, and I think that's the difficulty, that they still have to have a parliamentary process if it is actually to force him out. Any other way is still asking him, really in a nice way, and perhaps maybe this is an unnice way to ask him, please won't you step down, we've made a decision about you. But certainly President Zuma has said no by all reports, and that I don't see what they would have to say to him differently today that would make him actually say, okay, fine, I will step down.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Lukhona, we're talking about Zuma's political legacy right now, and surely it's hurting him a lot more by holding on to this power when it looks like the majority of people want him out.
Well, people have always wanted President Zuma out for some time now, and that has never really stopped him. At the time, he had serious power because he was still president of the ANC, and then he could get away with a lot because he could avoid accountability to the party by forcing his hand and his influence on the party structures, especially the National Executive Committee, which was actually quite jam-packed by his cronies and people that believed in him. For whatever reason, they really believed in him. But now, at this current moment, we are talking about someone who's lost that political base, lost the political power, and even his allies in the National Executive Committee are thinking about the future and centering themselves in terms of their own interests. And next year is going to be elections. Possibly the ANC, if it comes back to power, they still want to remain in cabinet. Of course, even in the short term, Fifi, there is an imminent cabinet reshuffle that will take place. Of course, people are saying it might not be an exodus of all the ministers that were with President Zuma and sort of enabling him and all his misdeeds in terms of governance. So the interests are starting to be fluid, and people are starting to take care of their own futures because President Zuma now is no longer going to be around to secure their own futures. So President Zuma, yes, is really on the back foot, and I think that it's a matter of days, really, that we see him go. Whether, as Xhanti suggests, he accedes to the request to actually resign by the call of the NEC, or he forces the parliamentary process, which inevitably would mean that he wants the entire cabinet to resign through a motion of no confidence, and he doesn't feel he is convinced about the reasons put forward by his own comrades as to why he should resign.
I mean, Xhanti, we talk about Zuma's economic legacy, and I think that we're all very familiar with the bad. I mean, he brought the country into a recession. He gave us a downgrade rating or junk status rating. Unemployment is at sickly levels. Is there any good?
Well, I mean, this is actually really the real thing. I think the intentions were there. I mean, I think quite honestly, and perhaps even in his own understanding, that he had good intentions for the economy. I mean, I think if you think about, some of the work that he talks about radical economic transformation. There are some things about black industrialists, for example, trying to fund, small business. There's some things there, but I think the carry through was quite messy. I mean, and many times people will say, look, there was something that he pushed in agriculture, and then we know how some of the agricultural incentives have actually just fallen apart because all that money would leak out. So I suppose in his intentions, perhaps he was trying to say, look, things are going to change. I mean, I think in the successive budgets even in his push, many times to talk about the national, development plan, that it's something that he would push, in terms of his language at least. Where the problem has been is how those things were implemented. That, of course, they had the wrong people there, and the influence perhaps around even the Guptas was to use the very good language that he was using in terms of how we need to change things to actually be able to actually take money out of states and out of projects. So I think if we had to give him anything positive, maybe it was that in real terms he was intending for good. Perhaps the people who were around him used that against him.
For sure. Would you say economically that Jacob Zuma was the worst president that South Africa has had under democracy?
He certainly must be, because I think, everything is, of course, proven by itself. One of the things that he has also presided on, in a very positive momentum at certain moments in the country. So, for example, once we were past the recession, which is, many people on his side will use as part of the reasons why he didn't do so well, because he had to handle a recession. He came at the worst time, and they will say, look, and then he tried to improve. And we had, a sort of a rebound after the recession, and he was in charge. But by and large, that was base effects. Really, it was a natural phenomenon that after you've been through a difficult time, you start, with an upshoot. And then everything started to deteriorate. So we would have had, over 2% growth. And since then, year after year after year, the economic growth was deteriorating. We've seen really many economic institutions and legal institutions fall under a lot of pressure. We know our budget has deteriorated in terms of our fiscal situation. So it has been really an atrocious time, because certainly, post-democratic South Africa anyway. Of course, before that, we've seen some really, really bad times. But I think in post-democracy South Africa, he has seemed to have reversed almost every gain we've made.
And then, Lukhona, you mentioned something very interesting there. You said if the ANC wins the 2019 elections. For some, they'd say that the very fact that Jacob Zuma agrees to step down could possibly be enough to secure the ANC's victory in 2019. What do you say?
Fifi, I think one of the things we must admit as a knock-on effect of President Zuma's leadership is that people have begun to question very much when they see the constitution being compromised. They believe in institutions much more. And really, the presidency of President Zuma has educated us on what a constitutional democracy is, what it ought to look like, and what shouldn't be let go of by citizens. And I think this awakening consciousness in society is what's going to prove a trap for this new leadership of the ANC. Every minute that they take a step, people like Xhanti, for example, will ask, is that within the rule of law? Is that following constitutionalism? And those questions become very important, because if this leadership is seen as entrapped in this same culture and practice of President Zuma of political expediency, where you want to take decisions on the rush, you want to compromise and short-circuit constitutionalism and processes of the organization itself, which is the ANC, and that's what I wrote about yesterday, to say that I believe that President of the ANC, Ramaphosa, is actually sidelining constitutional process in how he cancelled an NEC meeting last week. So these are all important things if we're going forward towards the 2019 elections. And of course, some voters will be saying they want to punish the ANC, especially in provinces like Gauteng, for things such as life as Dlamini. Some revelations are starting to again come out. Marikana is a discussion point once more. And these things are not good for the leadership of the ANC, because you need to then say, once President Zuma leaves, the ANC is going to begin to act differently. And if it doesn't, then you begin to say the problems are much more organizational. And of course they are, and we've been making this point for the longest time. You can change the faces, but if you don't change organizational culture, you are not going to impact properly on how the ANC ought to behave in government. So that's why I still put this, if they win 2019, because President Zuma might be, but what deals will they have made for him to part from that seat of president? And how will those deals come back to haunt them in future?
Of course, that's the thing. And I wonder if they'll make the public privy to those deals. But Xhanti, okay, so in the event that President Zuma does step down, Cyril Ramaphosa has essentially a year to fix things. Economically, what should he focus on to ensure a better chance for the ANC in those elections next year?
Lukhona raises a very, very important question, and it is really around our citizenry and the business sector, and certainly all of us in terms of how aware we are now about issues of the constitution, about the importance of the rule of law. And the danger, of course, is that because we're so desperate to reverse Zuma's legacy, President Zuma, of course, having pushed us really to the brink, we are now also starting, at the same time as we are aware, starting to be comfortable with some of the excesses around actually abandoning the rule of law. And that's something that we have to watch very, very closely. I mean, I think if you watch, for example, what happened around ESCOM, there's a sense there also that they cut some corners in terms of how they implemented some of the reforms that are quite important in terms of governance. Who is responsible for that sort of thing? How do you bring in a new board? How do you actually fire people? Whether they are actually responsible for some negative stuff or illegality. And a lot of corners seem to have been cut, and I think we've got to be very, very careful about that, because actually it might actually take us away from what we need to do. So, for example, he needs to really re-establish the rule of law. We have to do that because I think part of what everybody's been complaining about is to say we are no longer sure that South Africa, for example, is sticking to the rules. And this is something that has come through quite a lot through ratings agencies. Of course, we have to do policy reform. That will also be very, very important, and he has to do that because actually its effects are important. We've always talked about how we've got the right policies, but implementation is not right. But that's not true, right? Because we've got policies around education that seems to be failing us. We have policies around the mining sector that seem to be failing us. All of these things have to be done quickly because they have a direct impact on how people see things. And one of the things they're going to have to do is to actually foster economic policy that's very individual based, so that people have a sense of themselves that they are participating in the economy, that they are benefiting, rather than this whole situation that we've had over a long period of time that seems to treat people as the big masses. And I think that is something that's going to be quite important, because as people go to vote, they are now much more in tune about, am I center, or am I still going to be part of a grouping of radical economic transformation, or BE, because people have felt for a long time they're not being quite centered, and I think it's going to be a very, very, very important move for him to do.
Well, he's taken on the job, so we'll see how he is able to balance those two things. But we'll leave it there for now with that discussion. That was lead economist at Nascence Research Insight, Xhanti Payi, and Lukhona Mnguni, who is a political analyst at the University of KwaZulu-Natal.